Welcome to this week's vlog. Last week, Sue and I, together with two of my sisters and their husbands, went to the theatre here in Doncaster, where we saw a musical production with the title It Is Well With My Soul. You may well be aware of a hymn with that title. Now, the musical centred really around three main characters: D.L. Moody, Philip Bliss, and Horatio Spafford. I wonder if you've heard of all three. Anyway, D.L. Moody, of course, is probably the most well remembered of the three. He was a famous evangelist, and he travelled not only through the United States but around the world, including coming here to the UK. So he was part of the musical because the three men who I've named were friends. They knew each other. The second character in the musical was a man called Philip Bliss. He was a gifted composer and also a gospel singer. Now, as explained in the musical, although he was writing gospel songs, he had the opportunity to move to another part of the United States to have a much better income, a better home, in terms of quality, size. So it was very tempting, but the problem was that this new role would use his musical gifts, but not so much in the Christian way. So it would be more of a secular employment, though he would have some time to spend to continue his gospel singing and composing. So there was the challenge for him. Does he give up what he's doing now, mainly focused on Christian ministry, and move to this new opportunity that would be a blessing in material ways to him and his wife and kids? Or does he stick with what he feels God has called him to do? It's a great temptation, but ultimately he decided that God was called him to be someone involved in Christian ministry through music and through song. And so he gave up the opportunity for greater material wealth to focus on what God's calling on his life was for him. Now, the third character, and I want to concentrate a little bit more on him, was a man called Horatio Spafford. Some of you will have heard of him. He was a lawyer and a church elder. He was married to his wife, who was Anne, and they had 4 young daughters. Now, as told in the musical, in the story, Horatio Spafford had 2 major disasters that he encountered in his life. He was living in Chicago, and there was a great fire that engulfed the city of Chicago. Over 300 people were killed. Over 100,000 were made homeless. About over 3 square miles of the city was absolutely destroyed by the fire. Now, Horatio Spafford had invested in property in Chicago, and the fire destroyed much of his investment. So that was the first major disaster that hit him, which might seem bad enough, but it was nothing compared with the second. 2 years later, 2 years after the fire, Horatio Spafford and his wife Anne and their 4 daughters were planning a trip to the United Kingdom, where their friend D.L. Moody was engaged in a preaching tour, evangelistic tour. So they decided we'll go over to the UK during that period. But Spafford had some business affairs to attend to, so he couldn't go immediately. So instead, his wife and daughters set sail without him. He said, I will follow later. And tragically, whilst on the voyage across the Atlantic, their ship hit another vessel, and lots of lives were lost. Over 200 people were killed, including, desperately sadly for Horatio and Anna, their 4 daughters were lost in that tragic accident. They were drowned. And when Anna eventually reached the UK, she sent a telegram back to Spafford to tell him what had happened. What a tragedy to hit a family, to lose your 4 children in that way, in any way. And you might thought that that would turn Spafford away from God, that the tragedy, the desperation in his soul would turn him away from his faith. But it didn't. He hung on. And eventually he himself got on board ship and made his way to reunite with Anna, his wife, in the UK. And so the story goes, as the ship passed in the area where the tragedy had happened and his daughters had drowned, he wrote a poem called All It Is Well With My Soul. Let me just read one verse from that poem. In fact, Philip Bliss, who I mentioned earlier, later set the poem to music, and it became a much treasured hymn. Anyway, one of the verses is this: when peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. What an amazing statement of faith from someone who'd lost his much loved daughters in such a tragic circumstance. You know, when tragedy hits us, we have a choice, don't we? We can either say to God, God, I reject you, or God, I don't understand, but I cling to you. And that's what Spafford chose. And he was able to say, despite the pain and the sadness and the suffering, it is well with my soul. He commended his daughters into God's hands. Now, at the end of the musical that we saw last week, each person was given a little booklet with the question, is it well with your soul? Is it well with your soul? Let me just read to you the first little bit. You are holding a true story in your hands. That is the story of Spafford, but also in this booklet is the Gospel of John, the true story of the life of Jesus. This is an eyewitness account of history that has stood the test of time and made a difference to millions of lives around the world. Where did I come from? Why am I here? Where am I going? Are questions we all struggle with. This story will help you sort through the priorities of your life and answer your deepest questions. It's only through Jesus, the one who gave his life, that we might be forgiven and that we might know God as our Heavenly Father, that we might have a relationship with God through Jesus. Only through him that we are able to say that whatever happens in our life, it is well with my soul. So if you're not familiar with the life of Horatio Spafford and the story of It Is Well With My Soul, then I encourage you to look it up. It's an inspiring story. One man faced tragedy, but was able to say, it is well with my soul. God bless you. Thank you so much for listening today.